Have you ever found yourself in a place so dark that you didn't know where to turn? I never thought I would end up in a prison cell thousands of miles from home, facing charges that could change my life forever. But sometimes, it's in our darkest moments that we encounter the most powerful truths. What I'm about to share with you is my personal story, a journey that took me from religious rituals to a life-changing encounter that shook everything I thought I knew about God. After spending 2 years working in Bangladesh, I made some choices that landed me in a Thai prison. Sitting in that cell, stripped of my freedom and facing an uncertain future, I had nothing but time. Little did I know that those prison walls would become the setting for the most extraordinary spiritual encounters of my life. What happened? To me, there changed not just my beliefs, but the very core of who I am. The prison walls became my new reality. Days blended into weeks as I tried to make sense of my circumstances. I had always considered myself a devout person, someone who took his faith seriously and tried to live according to what I believed were righteous principles. Now, confined to a small cell shared with several other inmates, I found myself with nothing but time. Time to think, time to question, and time to pray. I came from a deeply religious background. My family had raised me to be faithful, to observe all the prayers, to fast during the holy months, and to read the sacred texts regularly. Even in prison, I maintained these practices. In fact, they became even more important to me. Without the distractions of the outside world, without work or family obligations, I dedicated myself to spiritual contemplation with an intensity I had never experienced before. One evening, as the sun set beyond the barred windows of my cell, I sat cross-legged on my thin mattress and began my usual practice. I would recite verses from the Quran, meditating on their meanings, letting the familiar words wash over me like a spiritual cleansing. This had always brought me peace, a sense of connection to something greater than myself. But this night was different. As I sat there, eyes closed, repeating the verses in Arabic, a language I had memorized phonetically even though it wasn't my mother tongue, something shifted in the atmosphere around me. At first it was subtle, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Then it became more pronounced. A feeling of dread began to creep into my consciousness, starting as a whisper in the back of my mind and growing into something I couldn't ignore. My heart began to race. Sweat formed on my forehead despite the cool evening air. I opened my eyes, looking around the dimly lit cell, but nothing appeared different. My cellmates were either sleeping or lost in their own thoughts, yet the feeling persisted and intensified. Then I felt it, a presence. Not a physical person, but something else entirely. It was as if an invisible entity had entered the small space, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of malevolence. My entire body tensed. In my heart, I knew with absolute certainty what this was. My religious training had taught me about such things, evil spirits, demonic forces that could torment believers and lead them astray. The fear became almost unbearable. I felt as though my very life was being threatened by this unseen force. My breath came in short gasps. My hands trembled, but my faith kicked in almost automatically. I began to rebuke this presence, calling upon Allah's name for protection, invoking the sacred words I had been taught would drive away such evil. I spoke with all the authority I could muster, demanding that this spirit leave me in the name of the Almighty. Yet it didn't leave. The oppressive feeling remained, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My mind raced through everything. I had been taught about spiritual warfare, about protection from demons, about the power of God's names. In desperation, as the fear reached its peak, I cried out in Urdu, my own native language, the tongue of my childhood, the words that came most naturally when I was at my most vulnerable. "God, help me," I shouted, not caring if I woke my cellmates, not caring about anything except escaping this terrifying presence. What happened next would forever alter the course of my life. The moment those words left my lips, that desperate cry for divine help, I heard something. It wasn't a thought in my own mind. It wasn't my imagination. It was a voice, as clear and distinct as if someone were standing right next to me speaking directly into my ear. And that voice said something I never expected to hear. "Call on the name of Jesus." My eyes flew open. I looked around frantically, but there was no one near me. My cellmates were exactly where they had been moments before. Yet I had heard it. I knew I had heard it. The voice was undeniable, unmistakable. Almost without thinking, driven by the terror of the moment and the strange authority of that voice, words tumbled from my mouth. "Jesus, if you are real, show yourself to me and—" I didn't even finish the sentence. Before the final words could form, the oppressive presence vanished. It didn't fade gradually or slowly retreat. It fled, as if driven away by an overwhelming force. The change was instantaneous and complete. One moment I had been drowning in fear and darkness. The next, I was sitting in my cell, breathing heavily, but free from that terrible presence. The relief was immense, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. What had just happened? Why had that voice told me to call on Jesus' name? Why had the mere mention of that name driven away something that had resisted all my other attempts at spiritual protection? I sat there for a long time, my mind spinning with questions, unable to sleep, unable to make sense of this experience. I had been raised to believe certain things about Jesus, that he was a prophet, a good man, a messenger of God, but certainly not divine. Yet, something had just happened that didn't fit within my understanding. The power that had been demonstrated when I called that name was undeniable. The evil spirit had fled instantly, completely, as if it had no choice in the matter. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to continue my normal religious practices, but everything felt different now. Questions nagged at me constantly. I would start to pray in the familiar way, but my mind would wander back to that night, to the voice I had heard, to the name that had driven away the darkness. I began having conversations with some of my fellow prisoners, carefully at first, trying to understand if anyone else had ever experienced something similar. Most looked at me with skepticism or concern. Some warned me that I might be going crazy from the stress of imprisonment. Others suggested I was being tested by God and should redouble my commitment to my faith. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened, something that demanded my attention and investigation. I found myself thinking about Jesus more and more, wondering about this figure from history who was revered by billions around the world in ways that my own tradition didn't teach. Several weeks passed. I continued my routine, but internally I was in turmoil. The questions never stopped. My sleep became restless. I would wake in the night, remembering that voice, wondering what it all meant. Then one night it happened again. But this time it was completely different. I was in my cell, lying on my mattress, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. My cellmates were asleep. The prison was as quiet as it ever got, with only distant sounds of guards walking their rounds and occasional noises from other cells. I wasn't praying or meditating. I was simply thinking, my mind once again circling around the questions that had plagued me for weeks. Suddenly the atmosphere changed again, but this time instead of fear and oppression, I felt something entirely different. The air itself seemed to become charged with a presence, but not a threatening one. This presence brought with it an overwhelming sense of peace, of purity, of something so profoundly good that my breath caught in my throat. It was as if time itself slowed down or stopped. The normal sounds of the prison faded away. I became acutely aware that I was in the presence of something, someone, of unimaginable holiness. I didn't see anything with my physical eyes, but in my spirit, in the deepest part of my being, I knew I was encountering the divine. Information began flooding my consciousness, not through words or thoughts, but through direct knowing. I understood things about God that I had never grasped before, despite years of religious study and practice. I knew, with absolute certainty, that God was holy, perfectly, completely, overwhelmingly holy. I understood that God was just, that his justice was perfect and uncompromising. And in that same moment of revelation, I became painfully aware of myself. All my life I had tried to be good. I had prayed 5 times a day, given to charity, fasted, studied scripture, and tried to live morally. I had accumulated what I thought was a lifetime of good deeds, hoping they would outweigh my sins on the day of judgment. But now, In the presence of this holy God, all of that seemed meaningless. I saw myself as I truly was, a man with sins, with failures, with shortcomings that no amount of good deeds could erase. I understood that God's perfect justice demanded payment for sin, and that payment was death. The weight of this realization was crushing, just as I felt I might be crushed under the weight of this awareness, just as I understood that I deserved judgment and had no way to save myself. Something happened that defied everything I thought I knew about God. I felt a touch on my left shoulder. It was gentle, warm, filled with compassion, and along with that touch came a voice, the same voice I had heard weeks earlier, but now speaking different words. "I forgive you." My mind reeled. Forgiveness now? Not on some distant judgment day, but right now, in this moment? My tradition had taught me that God was merciful and forgiving, but that this forgiveness was uncertain, that no one could know their spiritual state until the day of judgment. The idea that I could know, could feel, could experience forgiveness in the present moment was revolutionary and confusing. But how? I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard me. How can this be possible? How can I know I'm forgiven before the judgment day? The voice responded, and I could sense in it not just authority, but also love and patience. I am the way, the truth, and the life. These words meant nothing to me. I had never heard them before. They sounded important, profound even, but I didn't understand their significance or where they came from. "Who are you?" I asked desperately, needing to know the identity of this being who could forgive sins, who could make me feel forgiven in the present moment, who had driven away evil spirits with the mere mention of his name. "What is your name?" The answer came simply, "Jesus Christ." I collapsed. I fell from my mattress onto the cold concrete floor of my prison cell, trembling from head to toe. Tears streamed down my face. Every certainty I had held about the nature of God, about religion, about my own spiritual journey, everything was being challenged and overturned in this moment. I wept for hours that night, my cellmates eventually waking and watching me with concern and confusion, not knowing what to do or say. I couldn't explain it to them even if I tried. How could I put into words what I had just experienced? How could I describe an encounter that had shaken the very foundations of my belief system? When morning came, I was exhausted but also strangely alive. The heavy burden of guilt and uncertainty that I had carried for so long, even though I hadn't fully recognized it until it was lifted, was gone. I felt clean, new, reborn in some fundamental way. But I also knew I faced enormous challenges. I was still in prison, still facing legal troubles, and now I had this profound spiritual experience that contradicted everything my family and community had taught me. What was I supposed to do with this? I began to carefully share my story with a few of my fellow inmates. The reactions were mixed and intense. Some prisoners became angry with me, accusing me of betraying my faith, of being weak and giving in to foreign influences. They stopped speaking to me, and some even threatened me, warning me that what I was saying was dangerous and could get me hurt. But others responded differently. A few prisoners listened to my account with tears in their eyes. They too had felt empty in their religious practices, going through motions without experiencing real peace or assurance. My testimony of actually encountering God, of receiving immediate forgiveness, of being transformed by a personal experience rather than just following rules, this resonated deeply with them. Over the following weeks and months, several inmates began their own spiritual journeys, asking me questions, seeking their own encounters with Jesus. Small gatherings formed in the prison, with men from different backgrounds coming together to pray and seek truth. Even in the midst of incarceration, amid the hardship and uncertainty of prison life, something beautiful was beginning to grow. I knew my journey was just beginning. I had so much to learn, so much to understand about this Jesus who had revealed himself in such a powerful way. I managed to get access to some Christian texts, which I read eagerly, discovering that those mysterious words, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," were actually things Jesus had said during his earthly ministry. Recorded in ancient texts, I learned about Jesus' claims to be not just a prophet, but God himself in human form. I read about how Jesus had lived a perfect life, then willingly died to pay the price for human sin, that death penalty that I had felt I deserved in the presence of God's holiness. I discovered that Jesus had risen from the dead, conquering death itself and offering forgiveness and eternal life to all who would believe in him. Everything began to make sense. The pieces of the puzzle that had seemed so confusing started to fit together. I understood now why the mention of Jesus' name had driven away the evil spirit, because Jesus had authority over all spiritual forces. I understood why I could be forgiven in the present moment, because Jesus had already paid the price for my sins. I understood that holiness and love that I had felt, it was Jesus himself revealing his true nature. Friends, the story you've just read might sound unbelievable. It might challenge everything you've been taught or believed about spirituality and religion. But this is exactly what happened to me during those dark days in a prison cell far from home. My encounter with Jesus transformed me from a religious man performing rituals into someone who had met God personally and been forever changed by that meeting. What I want you to understand is that this isn't just my unique story. Throughout history and across the world today, countless people have had similar encounters. They've experienced Jesus in personal, powerful ways that have completely redirected their lives. Some, like me, came from other religious backgrounds. Others came from no religious background at all. But the common thread is this: when people genuinely seek truth, when they cry out in their deepest moments of need, Jesus has a way of revealing himself. You might be watching this and thinking about your own spiritual journey. Maybe you've been following religious practices faithfully but still feel empty inside. Maybe you've been carrying guilt and shame, wondering if you'll ever be good enough. Maybe you've experienced your own dark moments when evil seemed very real and powerful, and you didn't know where to turn. Here's what I want you to know. The same Jesus who revealed himself to me in that prison cell is still revealing himself to people today. He's not confined to one building, one denomination, one country, or one people group. He's not impressed by our religious credentials or scared off by our past mistakes. He comes to people in their lowest moments, in their deepest confusion, in their darkest fears, and he offers forgiveness, transformation, and hope. If my story has touched something in your heart, if it's raised questions you've never asked before, or if it's awakened a hunger for something more real and authentic in your spiritual life, I want to encourage you to do what I did. Cry out honestly to God. Ask Jesus to reveal himself to you. Don't worry about having perfect words or saying things the right way. Just be honest about your need, your questions, your doubts, and your desire to know the truth. God honors that kind of genuine seeking. Jesus said, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you." That's not just a nice religious saying, it's a promise. When you genuinely seek truth, you will find it. When you knock on heaven's door with a sincere heart, it will be open to you. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Has my story impacted you? Do you have questions about what I experienced? Have you had your own encounter with Jesus that you'd like to share? Let's continue this conversation together. And if you found value in this video, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell so you won't miss future content. Share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. You never know whose life might be changed by hearing about what God can do in the darkest circumstances. Remember, it's never too late for a new beginning. It's never too late to encounter the living God. It's never too late to experience real forgiveness and transformation. I discovered this truth in a prison cell in Thailand, but you can discover it wherever you are right now. Thank you so much for watching, and may you find the truth that sets you free. God bless you.